Today I'll be talking about neo-colonialism in the Ethiopian context. Despite neo-colonialism's neglect in academia, it remains an axiomatic tool in understanding Africa's current political and economic state. Although Kwame Nkrumah first introduced the concept with the seminal 1965 text, Neo-Colonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, the idea has remained underutilized in scholarship. Some argue this is because neocolonialism is seen as, quote, an outmoded concept in international relations and development studies, making many scholars squeamish whenever it is mentioned, unquote. Nevertheless, this paper proposes that because European influence and control endures, the only way to understand Africa today is by using Nkrumah's conceptualization of neocolonialism as a framework. This framework enables a serious discussion of Europe's colonial legacy. Mark Langan argues that any credible study of post-colonial Africa must look at the issue of neocolonialism and the resultant diminished sovereignty of African countries. In this video, I argue that under Zenawi's leadership, neocolonial policies were practiced in Ethiopia. Nkrumah's theory of neocolonialism, however, is situated to understand states that have been formerly colonized. However, I extend this phenomenon to include states that have not been formally colonized at all, positing that neocolonialism can be determined solely by an uneven political economic relationship rather than by a prerequisite of former colonization. I'll be investigating Ethiopia's political leadership under Zenawi, his diplomatic relations and policies, the role of foreign aid, and Ethiopia's economic relationship with the West, so looking at imports, exports, and production to sort of measure the extent of neocolonial practices. I think that understanding neocolonialism in this way is all the more pertinent in the contemporary because African countries like Ethiopia cannot sort of catch up with the West economically without first diagnosing the modern cause of their stagnation. And this notion of catching up with the West itself is a sort of problematic way to phrase Africa's and Ethiopia's development overall, because catching up and modernization always come from the West's notion of what modernization is, of what globalization and of what development looks like, but that's a topic for another video. So I recognize that there is great irony in scrutinizing the intricacies of European colonial legacy by beginning the discussion in one of the only two countries that have seemingly remained free of its domination. However, I argue that colonial rule does not happen in a vacuum, and despite Ethiopia's victory at Ottawa in 1896, it did not secure any meaningful protection against foreign political and economic influences. These are influences that in essence undermine Ethiopian sovereignty at every turn, serving the interests of Europeans, particularly the British. The sort of practical meaninglessness of the outcome of the war allowed Ethiopia to become a test case and opportunity for neocolonialism to take root, the first state that was, quote, in theory independent, all the outward trappings of international sovereignty, but in reality its economic system and thus its political policy were directed from outside. This is the general definition of neocolonialism that Nkrumah provides, that operates on the fact that 1. The power exercising foreign control is not necessarily the state which formerly ruled the territory in question. 2. Neocolonialism is based upon the principle of breaking up former large united colonial territories, or what Nkrumah says is balkanization. And 3. Foreign capital is used for the exploitation rather than the development of the less developed parts of the world. This aspect shows up specifically through foreign aid. Nkrumah characterizes aid as a revolving credit paid by the neocolonial master, passing through the neocolonial state and returning to the neocolonial master in the form of increased profits. Despite not being traditionally colonized like its counterparts and perceived as a beacon of independence decades after the deadly Adwa, Ethiopia meets the criteria outlined by Nkrumah. Recognizing neocolonialism as an active, albeit unapparent, phenomenon in the African quotidian is necessary to understand why, despite housing a significant number of fastest growing economies, Africa seems to be unable to catch up to Western levels of economic, political, and social development, right? 67 years after the first African country gained its independence. It should be quickly noted that, I cannot cover each aspect of the African continent in this span of this video. And making general sweeping claims of a presumed African reality is not the purpose of this video or this query either. Mark Langan rightly pointed out that, quote, there is analytical danger when speaking bluntly of either neocolonialism or Africa. However, he maintains that equally, however, there is analytical danger when trends affecting a collection of states are ignored. To reiterate, this video is done in the hopes to sort of dissect colonialism under Zenawi's regime in Ethiopia, a country, generally believed to retain its sovereignty and remain free from the colonial poison.
So to investigate the existence of and the function of neocolonialism in Ethiopia during Meles Zenawi's tenure as prime minister, I use this video to use a sort of historical approach to dissect the Western influence and policies during his leadership between 1991 and 2012. As the first prime minister of Ethiopia's current regime, Meles's rule laid the foundation of the neocolonial diplomatic relations and policies that I will be investigating in this video. I'll then succeed by an analysis of how Meles and his unequal relationship with the West impacted the state's economy, wealth, and industry during and after his tenure, and then I'll be doing that by sort of examining the economic reports of trade, import, and export. So by utilizing Nkrumah's checklist of neocolonialism, I think this method allows for a more complete discussion of how neocolonialism exists in the subaltern because it scrutinizes Ethiopian history and development under the notion that Ethiopia was far from safe from colonialism. By using the aforementioned data, I suggest that what may seem like disparate phenomena are really symptoms of the diagnosis that is neocolonialism. Theorizing Neocolonialism, a literature review in video form. So, the latter half of the 20th century for African countries was a time of sweeping changes that posed unimaginable challenges in the realm of nation building. Centuries of colonial domination had ensured that African countries and hence African people would not join the ever-growing and expanding world economy as equal contenders. If this was not bad enough, even when independence became a possibility, though the European attitude was more like, if you want independence, take it and return to the Dark Ages, it was continuously undermined. According to Nkrumah then, neocolonialism posed the sort of biggest challenge for Africans at this moment in time. He writes that neocolonialism was the worst form of imperialism, since for those who practice it, it means power without responsibility, and for those who suffer from it, it means exploitation without redress. Although independence should ideally be the apotheosis of statehood for African countries, independence was more of a ceremonial process that marked a cosmetic shift in the order of things. So leaders were still handpicked by European powers, wealth for those with high estimations of settler colonialism specifically was still concentrated among Europeans, and economic deals were still unbalanced and still favorable to the metropole. So despite the formal acknowledgement of independence, the real, work of nation building or organization were still a monumental task that Africans were faced with in the face of independence. So this was the state of Africa in the 1960s, and noticing this, Nkrumah offered a systematic analysis of neocolonialism that, for the purposes of this video, can be boiled down to a sort of macro-micro duality. So the macro represents the larger economic relationships between former colonies and metropoles, and the micro represents the sort of national bourgeois leaders that came into power after independence. So since Nkrumah, however, there have been succeeding contributions to this phenomenon of neocolonialism, but sparingly. It's not something that was sort of popular in academia in this moment, and even now it's sort of sketchy. But one important text is Vasily Vakrushav's 1974 book, Neo-Colonialism, Methods and Maneuvers. Here, Vakrushav attempts to acquaint the reader with the most typical traits and tendencies to be found in the colonial policies pursued by the imperialists of today. Again, he writes this in 1973, so it was sort of in the midst of, decolonization and liberation movement. So, like Nkrumah, Vakrushav sees the significance of exposing neocolonial methods because, quote, imperialists still succeed in applying these methods in practice, unquote. Vakrushav also emphasizes that understanding these methods becomes paramount because it is how these newly liberated territories would facilitate the struggles against it. So it would inherently have with it a notion of practicing resistance with after identifying what neocolonialism is. So Vakrushav, borrows really heavily from Nkrumah, but does not cite him at all, and defines neocolonialism like this. He says the colonial policy of the era of the general crisis of capitalism and the transition to socialism implemented by the imperialist powers in relation to the former and existing colonies by means of more subtle methods and maneuvers so as to propagate and consolidate capitalism and impede the advance of the national liberation movement, extract the largest possible profits, and strengthen the economic, political, ideological, and military strategic footholds of imperialism. So that's neocolonialism, according to Bakushov, right? And particularly in the second chapter of his book, Bakushov explains the manifestations of neocolonialism in the macro sense by discussing the international aid packages and foreign trade. This is also something that Nkrumah talks about, but we'll get into that. Bakushov says that particularly large-scale and systematic plunder of the developing countries and remaining colonies is effected by means of various forms of non-equivalent exchange, which mainly finds expression in the artificial imposition by the monopolies of the lowest possible prices on the developing countries' agricultural produce and raw materials, and the highest possible prices for their own industrial goods and raw materials. Bakushov further supports Nkrumah's thesis and contributes to a sort of critique of Western monopolies and how they set their experts not merely the task of justifying their neocolonialist policies, but also perfecting the methods and maneuvers employed and modifying them to suit the new conditions. So this is a very active sort of process that neocolonialism takes. It's not something that sort of just happened in the natural procession of neoliberalism and capitalism, but a sort of methodical way to maintain empire and the benefits of empire, that really empire itself in the way that we understood it in the 18th and early 19th century. 19th and 20th centuries. So this sort of informs the underlying cause of neocolonialism for both Nkrumah and Bakushov, right? This general crisis of capitalism. Neocolonialism was the beginning of the end for colonial capitalism. So Nkrumah writes, colonialism has achieved a new guise. It has become neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Its final bid for existence as monopoly capitalism or imperialism is the last stage of capitalism. So we might still be in the sort of last stage of capitalism that Nkrumah is talking about here. But he also says that it's his final bid for existence, sort of talking about how it's on its way out. It's been on its way out for all my life and more, so I don't know how accurate that is, but this is how we saw it. But we're mostly focusing on neocolonialism as tactics and maneuvers of maintaining empire, or the characteristics of empire in the wake of the end of empire. So it is in the wake of this crisis that colonizing countries allowed independence while making sure their influence was intact through the leaders that Fanon characterizes as the national bourgeoisie, particularly in his 1963 essay, Pitfalls of National Consciousness. It's also titled The Trials and Tribulations of National Consciousness. It's also another title for it, but it's the same article. So this query takes its observation and shows how European colonizers can establish control on states that were never under direct colonial rule to begin with, right? So Ethiopia here. Both Nkrumah and Bakushov move with the understanding that colonial rule must naturally come first. However, the tactics and maneuvers of neocolonialism in the context of Ethiopia suggest that this may not always be the case, that a state that's not colonized in the traditional sense can still exhibit signs of neocolonialism and neocolonial tactics. So, although Fanon precedes Nkrumah and does not use the term neocolonialism in his 1964 Wretched of the Earth, Fanon supports Nkrumah's micro aspect of his analysis in that the detrimental role of the national bourgeoisie in realizing independence. So Fanon writes, instead of being the coordinated crystallization of the people's innermost aspirations, instead of being the most tangible, immediate product of popular mobilization, national consciousness is nothing but a crude, empty, fragile shell. So among other reasons, Fanon credits this inertia to the fact that the national bourgeoisie in undeveloped countries' inability to rationalize popular praxis, in other words, their capacity to attribute any reason. So this is a sort of gaping chasm between the masses and the individuals who are supposed to not only be the leaders of a new nation, but become the embodiment of independence itself, right? The national bourgeoisie, because of their proximity to Western norms through their education and culturation, fail to make sense of what Fanon calls popular praxis, right? Being one with the people that they work to represent. So Ethiopia's case adds to this notion of an alienated leader by possessing leaders whose interests are based in ethnic lines. These ethnic lines were physically first laid down on Ethiopian soil by occupiers to divide and conquer, and later perpetuated by national bourgeois leaders to protect their own ethnic and interests, despite stating otherwise, or despite using language that makes it seem it's about the unity of the various ethnic groups, where you don't really see that in practice at all. They do employ the language of unity. These studies all converge on the idea that neocolonial rule takes place in formerly colonized places. However, in their 1990 book, The Invention of Ethiopia, Holcomb and Ibsa provide a hermeneutic on the neo-colonial nature behind Ethiopia's founding, that Ethiopia's sovereignty was compromised all along. So this book is more of a interpretation of Ethiopian history that sort of challenges the accepted notion or the sort of canon event of Ethiopia's uncolonizedness. Right? They're saying, well, no, let's re-examine Ethiopian history, the intricacies of Ethiopian history, and see how colonialism still showed up. And maybe colonialism is not the best word for it, but neo-colonialism sure seems like something that we could use to explain problems that a lot of other colonized African countries were facing, even though it wasn't colonized. So what's the issue here? They retain independence. Why aren't they, the best country in Africa? Why aren't they the richest? Why aren't they all this, right? They don't exactly say that, but I feel like part of their work is sort of addressing this sort of mythicized and romanticized notion of an independent Ethiopia. So they say that Ethiopia is a dependent colonial empire whose control over the colonies is being challenged by the colonial subjects, that the historically established economic and political subjugation by Abyssinia of alien nations begun at the time of conquest in the late 1800s has never been relieved, let alone eliminated, and that the objectives of the national liberation movements of the empire are appropriately with others who have risen up against colonial domination. They argued that European imperial powers, primarily the British, French, and Italian, concluded in creating a safe economic zone in the Horn of Africa, in which stability was ensured and access to the Red Sea granted, guaranteeing a constant flow of raw materials from the rich lands. Supporting Nkrumah's micro-level argument, Holcomb and Ibsa write, the nature of the Ethiopian state cannot be appreciated without attention to the collusion of imperialist interests there. Their mutual agreement to allow the state to exist gave Menelik and more substantially his successors a type of independence conditional upon controlling the area in the pre-prescribed way. This, they successfully argue, introduced the colonial mythology, the idea of an independent neutral Ethiopia, and it is in that political safety zone that Ethiopia survives until this day. That's what they say. So granted, Holcomb and Ibsa published their thesis about 35 years ago, and says that Ethiopia has experienced multiple governmental overhauls and political crises. However, I argue that the crux of their argument of imperial Ethiopia's neocoloniality stands the test of time by using Nkrumah's definition of neocolonialism, specifically during Melis's tenure. Right, I'm not going to use a 40-minute video to talk about the entirety of Ethiopian history and how that's neocolonialism. That's a whole dissertation topic, right? But we can do it specifically between the years 1991, which is when EPRDF, Reed, TPLF came into power, and then up until 2012 when Meles died. The regime is still the same, government is still the same, but I did want to look at this particular moment in time as not only to just make it methodologically approachable, but just also, he was the first leader of this new regime. So there's also some significance in that sense as well.
So, Ethiopia's current regime, now headed by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, was founded nearly 33 years ago when the Marxist-Leninist government, colloquially known as the Derg, was overthrown in 1990. This regime change was initiated by an amalgam of political groups under the banner of the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, or EPRDF. However, this collective was largely dominated by the influence of the Tigray People Liberation Front, or TPLF, which was Tigray's leading political party based in northern Ethiopia. So this violent overthrow of the Derg came after years of authoritarian rule that silenced and executed anything deemed counter-revolutionary, in essence, opposition in any form. It is important to note that under the Derg's regime, ethnic and even religious difference, notion so divisive in the history of and contemporary modern African states, was actually suppressed. Although the Derg devolved into authoritarianism, was somewhat informed by the socialist ideal of a working people's unity, regardless of other differences, right? Not actually in practice, as we saw that the Derg becomes very repressive, but it did have that idea behind it, even if it was thinly. But with the end of Derg came an antithetical change with the PRDF establishment of ethnic federalism, right? A federalism in which, quote, ethnicity represents the principal and decisive basis upon which the federation is organized, unquote. This became the dominant way to organize Ethiopia's regions and, by extension, politics. A leading proponent of ethnic federalism, later to become president and then prime minister of Ethiopia, was Meles Zenawi. Meles was part of the movement that fought against both Haile Selassie's regime and Haile Mariam's Derg, specifically as a member of the early iterations of TPLF. By the time the EPRDF took control, he was its chairman, which situated him to be the president of both the transitional government and the state, as well as prime minister in 2005, once the parliament was established. So it is not clear exactly from whom or where Meles acquired ethnic federalism as the mode of organization that was best for Ethiopia. I'm not particularly well versed on if you've read anything that impacted his politics in a certain way that made him think that, or that influenced him to espouse ethnic federalism. That really wasn't the focus of my research. It was more about how he used ethnic federalism and ethnic nationalism as a sort of way to organize his government and sort of politics. But I just didn't really dive deep into what he read as a political theorist or a political person that led him to that conclusion. But ethnic federalism, as we see, sort of poured kerosene on the intra-ethnic fire that was already raging from Ethiopia's consolidation during King Menelik's time. The internal boundaries that were drawn once EPRDF came to power were one manifestation of ethnic federalism, right? The forced grouping and inadvertently separating of peoples within the same ethnic group. The once 30 non-ethnic boundaries that were in place during Derg were reduced to the 12 regions that we see now, closer to the sort of ethnic division that Ethiopia experienced under Italian occupation. And I'll put maps up sort of this to show the difference, or to show the similarities between what Ethiopia looked like under the occupation and what Ethiopia looked like under or after EPRDF took power in 1991. So ethnic federalism was undertaken to solve for the common African problem of organizing the state with diverse groups and diverse interests, specifically diverse ethnic groups, right? In an interview with Zenawi, Harold G. Marcus writes, Meles clarified that the ethnic basis of Ethiopia's democracy stemmed from the government's fight against poverty and the need for an equitable distribution of the nation's wealth. Peasants must be enabled to make their own decisions in terms of their own culture. Power must be devolved to them in ways that they understand, and they understand ethnicity. However, allocating land to each group, based on this sort of utopian sense of how do we give peasants and different ethnic groups their own sort of agency through land, became a sort of logistical nightmare, considering that Ethiopia houses more than 80 ethnic groups. And this sort of sowed the seeds for decades of inter-ethnic violence and animosity, because some groups would get more land than they thought that others shouldn't, right? So Nkrumah saw this aspect in a continent-wide scale when he noted that neocolonialism is, quote, based upon the principle of breaking up former large United colonial territories, right? But despite being uncolonized proper, Ethiopia's national bourgeoisie nevertheless saw the utility of balkanization to essentially establish minority rule with TPLF at its head, while preaching their idea that was at best misguided and at worst malicious that division based on ethnicity allowed ethnic autonomy. This proved the complete opposite, as power and leadership positions were only allocated to TPLF members. Quote, all the country's heads of intelligence and the military chiefs came from the TPLF or were members of the military wing of the party during the armed struggle against Mengistu. Most of the top generals and other military leaders in the new army came from the TPLF's ranks as well. Unquote. Despite the promises of ethnic autonomy, the Ethiopian government was packed with and power was allocated among people of the Tigray ethnic group, or upper class Tigray people, not, the people of Tigray as in the peasantry or the working class. Although the Tigray people's population was only about 6%, or, which is about 3 million of the population by 1994, the land allocated to them was about 19,336 square miles. Other smaller yet statistically significant groups like the Walaita and Gurage were given no autonomous land at all and were instead relegated to the rather clumsily named region of southern nations, nationalities, and people with many other groups. The redistricting of Ethiopia was not a neutral symptom of regime change, but a metric for the neo-colonial motives of Meles and TPLF, because it was the physical manifestations of TPLF's aims to establish control as a minority group within Ethiopia, again, a state that has so many groups to begin with. The neo-colonial influence of Meles' insistence on ethnic federalism is not only evident in the current map that seems nostalgic of occupied Ethiopia, but also in the very way that political power was allocated to TPLF with the support of the West. This is all while political opposition was brutally silenced, reminiscent of the same Derg that Meles spent his early years resisting. Neo-colonialism in Ethiopia flourished under Meles' cozy relationship with the United States. Despite his Marxist-Leninist leaning, Meles was described as a good friend and strong security partner of the U.S. on its war on terror, receiving hundreds of millions of dollars in aid over the years and hosting the U.S. military drones that patrolled East Africa. In 2006, Ethiopia invaded Somalia as part of the U.S. war on terror after 9/11. It should be noted that Ethiopia's geographic and ideological benefit to the U.S. was no hidden phenomenon. In 2005, Bush's administration described Ethiopia as of strategic importance to the United States because of its geographic position and as the linchpin to stability in the Horn of Africa and the global war on terrorism. One might be quick to argue that it is only natural that a state leverages their relationship with other states to exert their will and interest in other parts of the world. Political realism is one school of thought that maintains that acquiring economic and political power is in the best interest of the nation as well, for the thought process behind it is if I will, my enemy will, right? But this was developed based on the observations of how European states acted and antagonized one another, states that were never under each other's domination in the racial and totalizing way that African civilizations were under other European nations. In the Ethiopian context, and the third world in general, where a history of colonial domination and occupation, genocides, and absolute terror was waged, rarely if ever do the modern African states have an equal footing in terms of economic or political capacity. This type of global power influence is maintained and functions by undermining the very sovereignty of the poor state. In the context of such a drastic power imbalance, as in the case between the US and Ethiopia, the latter's, Ethiopia's assumed sovereignty is taken for granted, that Ethiopia is a sovereign nation able to make decisions on behalf and in the interest of its citizens. For example, in Politics Out of History, Brown argues, quote, the sovereign state is one presumed capable of managing its interests in the external world. These capacities are what justify the state technically and legitimize it politically in an order in which the people are set to rule. The sovereignty of the people of Ethiopia is assumed despite despotic and unambiguous nepotism of Meles's leadership and generations of ethnic violence the government does little to quell. Neo-colonial influence also shows up in Ethiopia's internal politics. In 2014, under the banner of development and transformation, the EPRDF displaced and demolished the homes of Oromo farmers in Legetafo, a rural town outside of Addis Ababa, the capital. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, between 2013 and 2017, characterized these seizures as, quote, terrific efforts toward development, and that the United States could be a vital catalyst in this continent's continued transformation. Another significant method of neocolonialism, as mentioned earlier, is foreign aid. Under Meles, Ethiopia received $800 million in aid from the U.S. despite his human rights violations, his authoritarian rule, and overall undemocratic behavior. The UK, under Tony Blair, also had a close relationship with Meles in which, quote, the UK aligned strongly with the EPRDF's development agenda, providing direct budget support and funding initiatives linked to government service delivery. Ethiopia at times became the largest single recipient of UK bilateral aid globally, unquote. Despite the seeming benevolence of these acts, Nkrumah characterized aid as a revolving credit, right, that is funneled back to the country providing the aid at higher margins. This credit manifests in a political exchange that greatly benefits the Western nation and undermines inter-African relations. In a now withdrawn report by the UK's Department for International Development, it was stated that the UK relies on a stable Ethiopia that is supportive of our foreign policy priorities in the Horn of Africa, particularly in relation to Somalia and South Sudan. Ethiopia is the largest contributor of peacekeeping forces in the world, and particularly in its neighborhood, unquote. This is largely referred to as political conditionality that comes with aid, that states who receive aid usually have something to do to get that aid. It doesn't always have to be monetary sort of way that the country that receives aid, pays back the country that provides the aid, but there is some sort of exchange that also benefits the nation that is providing that aid. Gordon Crawford writes, security interests have become a more prominent explanatory factor in the post-2000 period. Indeed, the initial normative agenda of political conditionality as a tool for the promotion of democracy and human rights as statements and policy rhetoric has been replaced by its use as an instrument to promote Western security interests in line with the securitization of development. What is rather funny, though, is what used to be the sort of ambiguity behind the reasons for foreign aid. For example, the USA Aid website used to boast, until the paragraph became too embarrassing and was deleted in 2006, the principal beneficiary of America's foreign assistance programs has always been the United States. Close to 80% of the U.S. Agency for International Development's contracts and grants go directly to American firms. aid has created new markets for American industrial exports and meant hundreds of thousands of jobs for Americans. By taking advantage of a seemingly sovereign and independent state like Ethiopia, the West continues to enjoy the essence of a colonial relationship without the responsibilities of territorial occupation or day-to-day governance. For Nkrumah, aid in all its forms are one of the main vehicles for neocolonial exploitation. It is how former colonizers and Western nations managed to retain or establish control over weaker and poorer nations by a way of collecting massive interest and other political concessions. Ethiopia's case demonstrates how by being one of the U.S.'s biggest aid receivers, it forwards U.S. interests in the Horn of Africa, while real economic crises like the value of the Ethiopian birr plummeting every year are not confronted or ameliorated. The economic implications of neocolonial relationship manifest in other aspects of Ethiopia's macroeconomics as well. So in political economy, there's a notion that countries benefit economically by focusing on exporting a certain abundant natural resource that is present within their borders, which is called comparative advantage. For example, Walter Rodney in How Europe Undeveloped Africa talks about it like this. He says that those who justify the colonial division of labor suggest that it was natural and the relative capacities for specialization of the metropolitan colonies. Europe, North America, and Japan were capable of specializing in industry and Africa in agriculture. Therefore, it was to the comparative advantage of one part of the world to manufacture machines while another engaged in simple whole culture of the soil. This argument makes the case for formerly colonized territories or poor nations to focus on the export of one or two goods, making their economies heavily dependent on these products. Comparative advantage was first put forward by economist David Ricardo in 1817 to explain why international trade persisted even if countries were capable of producing everything within their borders, or would become capable of producing everything within their borders. Comparative advantage's explanatory power was noted and celebrated in political economy, albeit the theory's shortcomings when it comes to developing countries. For the system to be profitable for countries, Khalim Siddiqui points out that all factors of production must be fully employed. Labor and capital must be fully mobile within the country and must not move across the border. A country's external trade must be in balance and the market prices reflect the real cost of the products produced. Siddiqui maintains that this is far from the reality of developing countries and should be of no surprise considering that Ricardo develops this theory with European countries as units of measurement. By neglecting industrialization and promoting specialization, comparative advantage continues to be an important tool for the perpetuation of neocolonialism in Ethiopia. Nkrumah does not identify this phenomenon by name, but he writes, "They are imperialist specialists and apologists who urge the less developed countries to concentrate on agriculture and leave industrialization for some later time when their populations shall be well fed." In his introduction to neocolonialism, Jack Lotus also noticed the same pattern. He says African peoples are constantly told that they need Western know-how, that they cannot do without foreign capital, that they should not nationalize foreign enterprises, and that they should base themselves on agriculture and tourism rather than industry. Not only is comparative advantage inapplicable to African countries, but is also contradictory in that development hinges on mass industrialization. Despite her nominal independence, Ethiopia suffers from comparative advantage tendencies that make it increasingly challenging to take up mass industrialization and diverse exports the way Western nations have. In 1995, 4 years after Meles came to power, 53% of Ethiopia's export was coffee. By 2000, Ethiopia managed to lower this coffee dependency to 45.2% of total exports. However, despite the steady decrease in coffee dependence for exports, the majority of exports was still reliant on vegetable goods, not finished products. This trend continued even after Meles' tenure. In 2022, Ethiopia exported $4.2 billion worth of goods. This is actually a minimal amount considering the massive total Western nations export, despite having fewer naturally occurring resources to work with. Moreover, about 62% of the total exports were still vegetable goods. Most European nations and the United States do not export 62% of one product or one type of product. Western economies enjoy a diverse set of exports because of the colonial relationship that established the extraction of raw goods from poor nations and the building of finished products in richer nations through comparative advantage is retained. That system never really went away once colonialism officially ended. In 2022, Ethiopia imported a majority of finished products, so machines like gas turbines, broadcasting equipment, computers, chemical products like vaccines and packaged medicaments, and transportation, cars, planes, helicopters, and trucks. Looking at any other African nation and making the same comparison with their former colonizers yields the same pattern. For example, in 2022, 72% of Nigeria's exports was crude petroleum, 35% of Liberia and 95.9% of Mali's export was gold, and 57% of the Democratic Republic of Congo's export was refined copper. This is just a sampling to show that formerly colonized countries in Ethiopia are locked into this neo-colonial economic relationship where entire countries' economies rely on a handful of raw materials and vegetation, things that do not need to be made into finished products and so are valued less, even though the extraction is also, as expensive or should be as expensive, but there's still labor involved in the extraction of these raw materials. But because the capitalist system of the world puts more value into finished products and puts finished products at higher prices, higher price margins, these are valued less. And despite these countries fueling a lot of the industries, a lot of app products, a lot of the textile industry is heavily reliant on labor from these places, everything is valued less, and automatically that means more profits for the West and fewer profits for the global South. So comparative advantage becomes a neocolonial tool in which the lack of finished products from former colonies perpetuates the slower lack of industrialization. This economic relationship is neocolonialism at its most efficient, dictating the economic futures of entire states while existing in the subaltern. It is the same one that Vakrushev characterized as part of the various forms of non-equivalent exchange in 1973, as well as Nkrumah's 1965 notion of the double edge to the guillotine that cuts off Africa's wealth from Africa to the greater enrichment of the countries which absorb her materials and return them to her in the form of finished products. Under this process of mass industrialization, a key aspect of economic development is a slow and seemingly unachievable process. It can be successfully argued that the Industrial Revolution has not happened for Ethiopia in the way that it has for the Western world. So what's at stake and what are the implications? So the implications of neocolonial Ethiopia are concerning at the very least, right? Ethiopia's unique case of it never being colonized but retaining the exact same issues left by colonialism calls for a greater attention and analysis in African studies, history, and political economy. This is because African countries still continue to be theorized and studied from a perspective that assumes a false notion of sovereignty that is in de facto not really there. This research attempted to show how the various manifestations of neocolonialism need not require a history of direct colonial domination, and that colonial power did not and does not exist in a vacuum of an established border if there are open, including leaders. This is evident when considering that Ethiopia was surrounded by hostile European powers while her neighbors were experiencing the direct terrors of colonialism. Ethiopia escaped those everyday terrors by the skin of her teeth, but not by retaining actual independence or sovereignty. Ethiopia adapted and embraced neocolonialism as an alternative. In The Invention of Ethiopia, Holcomb and Ipsa write, the creation of Ethiopia was an extension of dependent colonial policy and carried in it the seeds of a plan for the future of the continent. Ethiopia became a test case for what is usually called neocolonialism, or corporate access to regions already subjugated. Contextualizing the historical relationship Ethiopia's current regime has with Western powers is key to untangling the manifestations of neocolonialism in a deceptively sovereign nation. It is not radical to suggest that when a poor and rich state meet to negotiate, the unequal footing will dictate the ways in which the bourgeois leaders of the poor nation leverage whatever influence they have, usually at the expense of the people and their sovereignty. This is class interests clashing. This is the classic case of that. Ethiopia's neo-colonial state may not be a solely Ethiopian phenomenon, and her condition, at the very least, necessitates the same inquiries in other states that may have escaped colonialism, but suffer from its ill-begotten 20th century child. Thanks for watching.